The doorbell rang out its chime, dissolving into the cold November air, sharp as frost and final as a clock striking midnight. I stood on the porch, clutching two pies still warm from the oven, their cinnamon apple fragrance curling upward like smoke from a memory. Against my side pressed the bottle of red wine I had chosen so carefully, a fragile bridge in glass, a peace offering I hoped might hold. On the drive over, I had rehearsed the words aloud until my voice felt foreign. Happy Thanksgiving. I've missed you. Simple, stripped of ornament. Words meant to span years of silence without crumbling under their own weight. When I heard footsteps approach and the knob turn, my heart surged with a naive, almost childlike hope that this would be the moment the exile ended, that the gap carved open by resentment might close with a single smile. The door swung open, and the light of the dining room poured out golden, familiar, painfully tender. Framed in it was my mother's face. I searched for warmth there, for even a flicker of recognition. Instead, I found only a flat steadiness, a mask held with practiced calm. Her lips parted and 4 words fell like stones into a pond, rippling outward to drown every fragile hope I carried. Sorry, wrong house. The pies trembled in my arms as though they too felt the absurdity. No storm, no raised voice, just betrayal delivered with surgical precision, as if kindness had been excised from her entirely. And then the door began to close. Not slammed in fury, not rattling its hinges, but pushed gently, almost politely, as though to erase me required no force at all. I did not move. My arms laden with gifts grew heavy, the pies transformed into stones, the bottle of wine no longer a symbol of peace, but a mute witness to my erasure. In the silence that followed, a music began to play in my mind, slow, aching piano notes, each stretched into infinity. Betrayal does not always scream. Sometimes it whispers through a door shutting softly. My breath caught in my throat. The porch light flickered above me. A wreath hung on the door, mocking me with its suggestion of welcome. From the narrow gap, I caught the smell of sage and butter, the intimate perfume of a feast that had once included me. I knew even as the door clicked shut that these details, the wreath, the flicker, the scent, would be etched into memory, returning to haunt quiet nights when I asked myself, what does family really mean? The world continued indifferent. Children laughed in the neighbor's yard. Somewhere down the street, a turkey was carved, laughter punctuating clinking glasses. Thanksgiving hummed in every house but mine. I stood rooted to the concrete, carrying offerings. No one would take a pilgrim without a destination, an exile who had miscalculated belonging. My mind unraveled backward through time. I saw every moment I had chosen silence over confrontation. Every time I had hoped reconciliation might sprout if I only waited long enough. Those choices pressed on me, now heavier than the food I carried, until I could hardly stand. I wanted to knock again, to plead, to shout through the wood for recognition. But the stillness told me what words could not. My presence was unwanted. In their story, I had already been erased. And yet I lingered, the cold biting into my skin. Some part of me could not accept that bonds written in blood could be dissolved so quietly. Some part of me still believed that if I stood long enough, the door might reopen. But the truth was final in its softness. And now I speak to you because this moment is larger than my own. Have you ever stood before a door, whether made of wood or silence, or someone's indifference, believing it would open to you only to be met with frost instead of warmth? Have you carried offerings of peace that no one wanted? Waited for forgiveness and received only erasure? If so, press 1. But if you believe rejection, however painful, can sometimes be a boundary drawn in mercy, a truth whispered to end a cycle of hurt, then press 0. Because on that porch holding pies that would never be eaten and wine that would never be poured, I understood something hard and unshakable. The cruelest betrayals are not the ones that roar, but the ones that close softly, leaving you to wonder if you were ever inside at all. I used to think family was supposed to be the one place untouched by transaction, the one place where generosity wasn't measured, where debts didn't accumulate like unpaid interest in the corners of your mind. In my imagination, family was a circle where giving came naturally, where gratitude was not spoken in grand speeches, but breathed quietly between hearts. I clung to that image for years, long after it had rotted at the core. Because in my family, the circle had been broken long ago, and I, without quite realizing it, had been cast in the role of the invisible lender, The silent treasurer, the spine that held the body upright, while the body denied the spine's existence. My name was Barbie, though. In our house, it often felt like I was more function than person. I became the one who wired money at midnight, after double shifts. My hands stiff and aching as I tapped numbers into glowing ATM screens. I became the one who scribbled checks in the margins of my own hunger, choosing their stability over my meals. I became the one who never said no, because no in my family wasn't just a refusal, it was a spark tossed on. It would flare into guilt-laden silence, into my mother's wounded sighs, into my brother's practiced disappointment. My mother, Willa, was the conductor of this quiet orchestra of obligation. She had a way of making her requests sound like lullabies sung sweetly but reinforced with hidden steel. Honey, I hate to bother you, but the gas bill came earlier than I thought, and you know how cold your brother gets. Her voice always tilted just so, as if balanced between affection and disappointment, making refusal feel like cruelty, as if saying no would not only deny her warmth, but deny love itself. She never used words like duty or burden. She wrapped it all in the velvet of family, always reminding me that family takes care of each other. The unspoken addendum, the one I swallowed without naming, was that in our family, care only ever flowed one way out of me into them. And Dean, my older brother, the golden son, perfected the art of receiving as if it were a birthright. He cloaked his entitlement in the grand robe of tradition, always finding ways to paint my sacrifice as virtue. At family dinners, he would raise a glass and toast me with a smile too wide, saying, "Barbie is the glue, the heart of this family." And everyone would nod, clap, even tear up a little. They thought it was gratitude, but I heard it for what it was: justification. With those words, he transformed my exhaustion into a moral duty, made my depletion into a noble arrangement. It was not thanks, it was absolution, a way of excusing his own comfort by branding my servitude as love. I remember the 1,000 small humiliations more than any single grand betrayal. The thick envelopes arriving in the mail, electricity bills, property taxes, water payments. Each one carried like a secret weight into my apartment, stacked on my desk, though they didn't belong to my life. The kitchen sink that broke one summer when I wired money for a plumber before I even paid my own rent, only to overhear my mother later tell neighbors that Dean had stepped up like a true man of the house. The winter I paid 3 months of heating in advance so they wouldn't freeze, and when I asked if we could spend Christmas together, Willa smiled softly, tilted her head, and told me they already had other plans. That was her gift. The ability to erase me while thanking me in the same breath. To make me feel both indispensable and excluded, both treasured and invisible. She could look at me with tender eyes, call me sweetheart, and still cut me out of the family's story with surgical precision. Dean played his role alongside her, shaking his head at me whenever I hinted at imbalance. "Come on, sis." He'd say, his voice laced with gentle reproach. "Don't keep score, we're family. You know it's not about money." But it was always about money. It was always about the quiet river of cash that flowed from my hands into theirs, the river that allowed him to play the role of carefree heir while I drowned in the undertow. I became a ghost haunting their household. My name appeared on every payment line, every transfer slip, every check, yet my presence never materialized at the table where decisions were made. They lived inside a house I had effectively built brick by brick, dollar by dollar, and then told me when it suited them that I had no place inside it. And the memories piled up like loose change, rattling endlessly in my pocket. Nights hunched over a flickering ATM, my hands trembling from exhaustion as I typed in the exact figure my mother named. Days when my own landlord threatened eviction because I had covered yet another emergency at their address instead of mine. The image of the roofer shaking my hand, thanking me for quick payment, while Dean later posted photos online about keeping the family house strong. The suffocating phone calls where I almost said no. Almost let my hand fall from the keyboard before Willa's silken voice drifted through the receiver. "You don't want your brother to think you've forgotten him, do you? He's been under so much stress. The guilt would flood me so completely that refusal became unthinkable. Looking back now, I see it with brutal clarity. It wasn't love. It wasn't loyalty. It was manipulation wrapped in silk exploitation disguised as tradition denial, masquerading as kindness. They built their stability on my back brick by brick, bill by bill, until I was bent nearly double under the weight. And when the structure was finished, when the roof no longer leaked and the house glowed warm with my invisible labor, they stood inside and told me I didn't live there, that it was theirs, always theirs. So when I stood on that porch one Thanksgiving, pies in my arms and wine pressed against my ribs, the story didn't begin there. That moment was only the final scene, the last act of a long play I had been forced to perform. The betrayal did not begin with a door closing in my face. It began years earlier with every check I signed, every bill I paid, every silence I swallowed. That night when my mother looked at me and said, "Sorry, wrong house," it wasn't just the sound of a door shutting. It was the culmination of years of erasure, the final proof of what I had refused to believe I had given everything. And in return, I had been written out of the story entirely. I remember my birthday like a bruise that never fully fades, not because there were candles or a cake or even my name spoken out loud, but because the only message that reached me was a request shaped like a greeting, a chirp on my phone that said, "Sweetheart, could you send some money? Dean's in a bind again." And there it was. The whole family alphabet reduced to currency. No. Happy? No birthday. Only the arithmetic of what I could wire before the bank closed. I sent it, of course I did, because by then saying yes had fused into the marrow of my bones. I told myself duty was a kind of love, told myself the ache in my chest was gratitude arriving late. But when the transfer confirmation blinked and my balance dimmed, it felt like I had blown out my own candles alone in the dark and the smoke smelled like numbers. That day was supposed to be mine, one square on the calendar that carried my name, but it dissolved like sugar in water, leaving only the aftertaste of and that taste lingered. It coated the days that followed, braiding themselves into a rope of small humiliations, the kind you can wear like a necklace and call it pearls if you're desperate enough. At the family party that weekend, I arrived early, casserole balanced in my hands, still hot enough to sting my palms. I set it on the counter beside platters Dean bragged he had paid for, though I knew the receipts by heart. A woman in a glittered cardigan tapped my shoulder and asked if I could refill the ice buckets. Another, smiling with the breezy entitlement of the oblivious, pressed her empty glass into my hand, her thanks floating toward me like a tip tossed into a jar. When I murmured, "I'm family, not staff," her eyebrows lifted in polite shock before she said, "Oh, of course," and still held out the glass. I took it because somewhere along the way, service had become my native language. Across the room, Dean laughed, his arms slung over a chair like a prince painted into a Renaissance canvas, soaking up compliments for hosting, as if hospitality leaked from his pores and not my bank account. When the toast clinked to Willa, and Dean keeping the home fires burning, my mother tilted her chin toward me in that private way she has of both acknowledging and erasing at once, a nod that said, "You know why we need you, and also we don't need you for this." I smiled like a well-trained shadow and picked up a stack of plates. By then, the soundtrack had already begun in my head, a chorus of party laughter receding the SFX of voices moving down a hallway I wasn't allowed to follow. Smaller, softer, fainter, until it sounded less like celebration and more like memory itself wearing thin. That's how it always was. I hovered near the sink because the sink never questioned my presence. I scrubbed casserole dishes. No one admitted I had cooked, ferried napkins, poured wine into mouths that toasted the house, not me. When someone spilled a drink on the carpet, I dropped to my knees with a towel, a reflex as natural as breathing. Later, I overheard the woman in the glitter cardigan lean toward another guest and whisper, "They hired such attentive help," and I felt the words slide through me as if my body were made of glass. I left early without saying goodbye. Slipping into the cold night, the party following me, only in echoes. The laughter thinned behind the closed door, softer with each step, and I wondered not for the first time if sound itself disliked me, if even noise learned to step back when I entered. There was a night not long after when I couldn't stand my apartment. It had become a holding cell for envelopes addressed not to me but to them. The walls seemed lined with paper cuts, each one carrying their names but demanding my blood. So I drove. The highway blurred into streaks, the radio turned to static. I pulled into a motel whose neon sign blinked a tired red vacancy. At the front desk, I checked in with the kind of voice you use when you don't want to be recognized by your own throat. The bed sagged under the weight of strangers' stories. I opened the nightstand expecting a Bible. But instead, I found a folded flyer shoved in the gap like an afterthought. Cheap paper smeared ink, a slogan that felt like a dare. Family means always having a seat at the table. I laughed. Then the sound cracked and wrong because I had bought chairs they wouldn't let me sit in, paid for table leaves I wasn't invited to, and there in the low lamplight with the patterned bedspread itching against my wrists, I crushed the flyer in my hand until it became a small, stunned animal and tossed it toward the wastebasket. I missed. It bounced against the wall with the smallest tap, a sound too gentle for the fury folded tight inside me. The memories never arrive in order. They tumble like receipts shaken from a glove box, dates and totals urgent and mundane. The text that read, "Can you cover the electric this month? Sweetheart, Dean's card is maxed," which arrived the same morning I received a reminder about my own rent. The roofer who looked me up and down and asked to speak to the owner, then billed me anyway. The afternoon, my mother placed her cool hand over mine and said, "You're our rock," a compliment that tightened around my throat like a leash before reminding me that rocks don't complain. Rocks just hold the house in place. I slept that night in the motel with the TV turned low, a stranger arguing about a game I hadn't watched. Silence had begun to sound like consent, and I was done consenting. Still in the blue flicker of the screen, the old chorus returned, the laughter of parties processed through distance, the auditory illusion of being left out replaying in a loop. I pressed the heel of my hand against my ear as if I could smudge it away. When morning pried the curtains apart, I picked up the flyer and smoothed it flat, reading the slogan again until the letters blurred. Family means always having a seat at the table. Maybe that was true somewhere in some postcard version of life. But my family had always lived by a different motto. Family means always having your wallet at the table, and if you're lucky, a spot on the rug near the radiator to eat alone. I wish I could say there had been one clean fracture, one sudden snap where the story broke and I woke up. But exploitation is patient. It doesn't knock down walls in a storm, it seeps through them like water an inch at a time until the structure rots from the inside. It arrives in teaspoons and stays for seasons. So I kept paying. I kept showing up with arms full and pockets light. I kept learning the choreography of being present but never counted. On the drive back from the motel, a billboard loomed above the road, glossy wood glowing like honey advertising a luxury dining set. 8 chairs lined up like promises. I thought about buying it and shipping it to the house with a note that said, "Save me a seat." But then I pictured Dean admiring the craftsmanship, my mother telling the neighbors she'd gotten a great deal, and I decided to keep my money quiet a little longer. That's the thing about their kind of love, it trains you to mistrust your own version of events. It teaches you to doubt your memory and call it generosity. It convinces you to put quotation marks around your pain so it looks like someone else said it. If you listen closely, you can still hear the hallway laughter shrinking as I hold these moments up to the light. The SFX of exclusion, a sound edit where the room dims the second I begin to speak. And I'm done pretending it's the soundtrack to a happy film. Here's the truth I understand now, truer than any slogan on a motel flyer, louder than a dozen polite toasts. Long silence is not tenderness. It is not patience. It is not grace. Long silence is policy. It is an editing tool. It is a careful instrument pressed against the spine of a story until the inconvenient character me is shaved down first to a footnote, then to white space. Long silence is no longer love. It is a tool others use to rewrite, and the bruise of my birthday, the one that never fades. It is proof etched into memory that love without respect is just a currency exchange, and that a seat at the table is worthless if all you're allowed to do is pay the bill. I used to believe that my sacrifices were building something solid, something invisible but real, like the skeleton of a bridge that no one noticed but everyone walked across. I told myself each dollar I tucked away each meal, I skipped each small luxury I denied myself was a beam in that bridge, a thread in the safety net that would catch us when the inevitable storms came. I saved with discipline, the way monks pray quietly without recognition, but with the steady faith that it mattered. Vacations became postcards I never bought. Dresses I admired in shop windows became ghosts I passed by without slowing. Dinners out with friends turned into polite refusals, excuses about being tired or busy when the truth was I had already promised my money to a future crisis. I whispered to myself that it would be worth it. Worth it when the roof leaked, when illness struck, when the car broke down on a deserted road. Worth it because family was the kind of word you could anchor your life to even if it weighed you down. I called it the emergency fund, though in truth it was closer to a vault of survival. A silent partner, a locked box of reassurance that let me sleep at night. Knowing it was there gave me the illusion of security. Knowing it was there made me believe my sacrifices weren't sacrifices at all but investments. Until the day I checked the balance. I can still see the screen's cold glow, the numbers glaring up like an accusation. The balance gutted, drained, not for surgery, not for flood damage, not for any disaster that could be. The vault was empty, but not by fire or storm. It was emptied by choice. Their choice. For a ring. Dean's engagement ring. Heavy with gold, sparkling with a stone so large it looked as if it had swallowed the sun. A ring bought not with his sweat, not with his hunger, but with mine. Every skipped vacation flickered there in the facets. Every denied luxury winked in the sharp glint of the stone. It sat on his fiancée's hand like a crown, as if love itself could be purchased with the hours I had worked until my bones ached with the meals I had pushed aside while convincing myself I was full. When I asked my mother, my voice trembling but still soft, her reply was smooth as glass. She did not falter, as though the line had been rehearsed 100 times in the mirror. It was a family decision, sweetheart. We wanted him to start his marriage right. That word hit me harder than the theft itself. We, as if a council had been held, as if votes, but I had not been there. I was not included in the family that decided. I was only the family that paid. My chest went still, my thoughts dropping into a lower register, a monotone realization humming in the base of my skull. They will take everything, every dollar, every effort, every trace of what I build, and they will call it theirs. In my mind, a violin drew one long note taut as a wire stretched too far. It vibrated with dread, with inevitability, and I felt it ringing in my bones until even that sound gave way to silence. Silence heavier than thunder. Days later came the second fracture, this one not in numbers but in words. I opened my phone and there was Dean's face smiling back at me from the local news. The headline praised him as the visionary force behind a community project. The very project I had poured myself into for months. Every idea had been seeded in my notebooks. Every outline had been drawn from every late-night draft had been typed through my sleepless eyes. And yet, there he was gesturing in the staged photo, his chest puffed, his hand slicing the air like an architect of futures. The quotes printed beneath were my own words, cut and pasted into his mouth. I sat at my kitchen table, hands trembling so hard the phone nearly slipped. Each sentence I read was like watching my fingerprints being sanded off. My name was not there. Not once. With each line, the voice inside me grew colder, flattening into something low, stripped of warmth, stripped even of rage. Not outrage, not heartbreak. Something worse. An eerie calm whispering, "You are invisible to them. Your work is theirs. Your silence is the soil in which they plant their legends." The violin scraped again, not a melody now, but a strained, ugly sound, the kind that makes the air brittle. And then it too fell away, leaving only the hollow echo of realization I had not been a daughter in their eyes, I had been a donor. A ghost laboring in the dark while they claimed the light. I thought about the pies I had carried to doorsteps, the rent payments I had covered without acknowledgement, the bills I had paid before paying my own, the hours I had worked until exhaustion wrapped itself around me like a second skin. All of it erased with a flick of their smiles, rewritten into a story where Dean was the hero, and I was the ghost money came from. The voice inside me dropped lower still, a narration scraping against the ground. They will never stop erasing you unless you draw the line yourself. That night, I could not eat. I sat at the table with my untouched plate staring at the wall as if it might offer a way out. I replayed the ring flashing on her finger. The article hailing his genius. My mother's polished voice insisting on family decisions. each memory pressed into me like a branding iron, searing away whatever illusions I still carry. I used to believe that family meant protection. Now I understood that in my family it meant extraction. My sacrifice was never a gift. It was a resource. And resources are meant to be used until they run dry. The realization left me cold, but it also left me awake. And now I turn outward to you who are listening. Because this isn't only my story. It is the story of anyone who has seen their work paraded in another's costume. It is the story of anyone who has watched their sacrifice turned into someone else's applause. It is the story of anyone. So I ask you, if this happened to you, what would you do? Would you let it pass? Would you swallow the silence, convince yourself maybe it doesn't matter? Would you press 1 for silence, or would you stand up? Would you speak, even if your voice shakes? Would you break their script before it erases you completely? Would you press 0 for defiance? Because here is the truth that finally struck me: silence is not neutral. Silence is permission. And I had been granting it for far too long. I didn't plan it as a rebellion. Rebellions are supposed to be loud, flaming things, announced with fists pounding on tables, voices cracking through ceilings, doors slammed until frames splinter. What happened that night was smaller, quieter, almost mundane. It began not with rage, but with insomnia, a late-night decision to check my bank account when sleep refused to come. The glow of the screen cast its pale light across me. Usually I looked at those numbers through eyes glazed with exhaustion, softened by guilt. But that night, my eyes were sharp-narrowed, tracing each line of the transaction history as though I were a detective at a crime scene. And in a way, I was. The crime had been committed slowly, with the patience of termites chewing through the beams of my life until the structure swayed. I scrolled back through the months, then the years, through all the invisible threads that tied my life to theirs. Each line was not just an entry. It was a sentence in a story. But not the kind of story families boast about at dinners or write in Christmas cards. No, this was the story of my slow erasure. Their water bills under their address, their gas bills monthly as tides, their mortgage top-ups numbers that carved valleys in my balance, a tuition payment for Dean one so large it swallowed 3 months of my own wages whole. And then I found it the wound that still pulsed whenever my memory brushed against it. The withdrawal that had emptied my carefully built emergency fund. My security, my safety. My small vault of survival converted into a wedding ring. A ring heavy with gold and studded with a stone that caught the light as if it had swallowed the sun. A ring that glittered on his fiancé's hand while I sat at my kitchen table eating ramen, the broth lukewarm, the noodles clumping my stomach, turning with something more bitter than hunger. My fingers hovered above the trackpad cold despite the laptop's warmth. In my ears, in the deepest part of me, I could almost hear it, a violin string stretched beyond reason, trembling, threatening to snap. And then silence. Not absence, not emptiness, but decision. I moved my hand deliberately, not in panic, but in the first click was surgical. I opened settings and canceled the autopay schedules that had siphoned money from me month after month, silently, mercilessly, like a slow bleed. Another click, the standing transfers to my mother's account frozen. They had once been dressed up as temporary help, a phrase that sounded harmless, even noble. But temporary had metastasized into endless. And then the last click, the debit card. The one that had been borrowed for emergencies, but somehow always found its way into Dean's wallet at the gas station, at the grocery store, at the bar. I canceled it. The confirmation box popped up sterile and matter-of-fact, this card has been deactivated. I whispered the words aloud, my own voice low, almost flat. Deactivated. Like a switch had flipped inside me, and for once it was me holding the power. But I knew actions weren't enough. Not this time. They had painted themselves as the providers, the survivors, the self-made heroes. I was always erased, always invisible, always the ghost in the machine of their comfort. Words alone wouldn't save me now. I needed something that would stand even when my memory was doubted, even when their voices tried to drown mine. So I reached for the black notebook I had bought months ago, the one that had sat untouched on my shelf like an accusation, like a dare waiting for me to be brave enough. I pulled it down. I opened to the first clean page. I pressed the tip of my pen against the paper hard enough to feel it bite. Family ledger. I wrote it in block letters, each stroke heavy, almost carved. The sound of the pen was louder than I expected, scratching through the quiet. It was a new kind of music, rough, raw, defiant. Line after line, I began to list what had been taken. March gas bill, April electricity, Dean's tuition transfer confirmation number 0415, emergency fund wedding ring $8 $200, family decision. I didn't stop there. I didn't leave out the small humiliations because humiliation stacked becomes a mountain. The plumber I paid when the sink broke. The grocery delivery I covered because Dean was short that week. The endless string of Uber rides booked on my card for errands that weren't mine. Each entry was a wound reopened, yes. But with each stroke of ink, the wound also closed, stitched by the record, sealed by the truth. By the time I reached the 10th page, I felt as if I were holding a spine in my hands. Finally, something strong enough to keep me upright. I flipped back to the first page, ran my hand across the ink. The words glared up at me like evidence in a courtroom. For years they had said, "Don't keep score, Barbie. Family isn't about numbers." But here were the numbers undeniable even to me. They could smile while erasing me, but they could not erase this. I set the pen down and opened my laptop again. The violin in my chest began its tense hum once more, softer now, not frantic but deliberate, as though it was accompanying the rhythm of my keystrokes. I opened a new email. The cursor blinked like a pulse. Subject: financial support. Immediate termination. My fingers moved slowly, each click of the keyboard landing with the weight of a stone dropping into water. From this date forward, I will no longer provide financial support for household bills, maintenance, or personal expenses. I have kept detailed records of all contributions to date. This decision is final and non-negotiable. The draft grew with clarity, not anger. Anger had long ago burned away, exhausted by years of silence. What remained was precision, cold and sharp like a scalpel cutting clean. I sat back and read it. Not one. Each time I expected fear to rise in me, or guilt, or the familiar sting of shame. None came, only calm. My fingers hovered above the send button. The violin inside me drew tight again, then faded as if it were holding its breath, waiting. But I didn't send it. Not yet. I wanted to feel the power of restraint. I wanted to savor the strength of knowing I could choose the moment. For once, they would wait on me. The unsent email was like a sword-sheathed present, sharp, undeniable. I saved the draft and closed the laptop. The black notebook, the family ledger, lay on top of it, heavy with truth. I pressed the flat of my hand against its cover, and for the first time in years, my shoulders eased. I noticed the small sounds in the room, the ticking of the clock, the hum of the fridge, the faint scratch of pen on paper where I had pressed too hard. Ordinary sounds. But to me, they were a symphony. Proof that the world kept moving, proof that I existed outside their demands. I leaned back in my chair and let the silence expand. Not the suffocating silence of exclusion. Not the manipulative silence they had wielded against me like a blade. No, this was silence of my own choosing. And when I finally spoke, my voice was low, slow, deliberate, each word falling into place like stones sinking to the bottom of a river. I'm not angry anymore. I am awake. Awake to the truth of what they had done. Awake to the truth of who I had become. Awake to the possibility that the rest of my life did not have to be lived as their ghost. And now I turned. If your labor, your savings, your sacrifices had been drained to build someone else's legend, if your name had been erased while theirs was praised, if your family smiled while rewriting you out of the story, what would you do? Would you keep silent, convincing yourself that silence is love, that erasure is normal, that sacrifice is your role? Would you press 1 for silence, or would you pick up your own pen, write your own ledger, prepare your own message, even if you never send it, and reclaim your story as yours alone? Would you press 0 for defiance? The choice is not mine to make for you. I made mine when I clicked deactivate. I made mine when I wrote family ledger across the first page. I made mine when I whispered into the silence I am awake. I used to believe the hardest part would be walking back into that house, stepping over the threshold as though the past weren't buried in its very foundation. But it was. The hardest part came after, when I was already inside, forced to breathe the same air that had carried the scent of my cooking, the hum of my repairs, the heat of my labor. That air had once been mine, too heavy with sweat and sacrifice, yet they had decided long ago that they were entitled to breathe it without ever naming me, without even admitting I was the one who kept it circulating. Under my arm, I carried the family ledger, thick and worn, its cover bent like a book that had traveled too many miles. It was no diary, no journal of feelings, but a record of reckoning. I carried it the way a witness carries evidence into a courtroom because, in truth, that's what it had become. My courtroom was the kitchen where so many of my silent sacrifices had disappeared, swallowed whole by the story my family told about themselves. When I entered, I did not greet my mother. I did not sit down. I did not even take off my coat. Instead, I placed the ledger on the table and pushed it across the wooden surface until it came to rest against her teacup. The scraping sound echoed louder than the ticking clock, louder than her shallow inhale. She looked at it the way you look at a spider on the wall, pretending it isn't there, hoping it will crawl away on its own. Finally, with that familiar tilt of her head and a patronizing calm that had once reduced me to a guilty child, she spoke. "Barbie, you'll never remember all of this. You exaggerate. You always have." I did not argue. I opened the ledger. The paper cracked the air with each turn. Page after page filled with numbers, receipts, confirmation codes. My handwriting was the architecture of survival. "I don't have to remember," I said, voice low and steady. I wrote it down. Every dollar. Every month, every repair, every tuition payment, every bill that kept this roof above your head. "I don't need to remember because—" I turned the book toward her. She spared it one brief glance, no more than a flick of her eyes, before leaning back and sipping her tea as though bored with a child's tantrum. That dismissal cut deeper than any insult. My years of sacrifice flattened into a glance shorter than a breath. Inside me, music began, an imagined violin string pulled taut, vibrating with an anger I refused to release. My voice dropped colder, steadier. "You don't get to tell me I imagined this. You don't get to erase me anymore." Her faint smile returned the smile of someone who believes she's already won. "Barbie," she murmured, "you'll never keep it straight. Dean knows how to handle things. You've always been too emotional. Too dramatic." With one manicured fingertip, she pushed the ledger back toward me as if it might stain her nails. That single gesture, soft, dismissive, was a lifetime condensed into one motion. I left the book there open. Let the numbers scream into the silence. Sometimes silence is sharper than shouting. 2 days later, the envelope arrived, not from my hand, but from my lawyer's. Neutral font, official seal, crisp edges, notice to vacate. 30 days. I pictured her opening it at breakfast, her fork hovering midair, eyes narrowing as she read. For once, the numbers were not hidden in my drained bank account. They sat in black ink on paper that could not be dismissed as exaggeration. I was miles away, yet I swear the air itself shifted the moment she read it, as though the house realized who had been holding it upright all along. Dean called first. His number lit my phone again and again until I finally answered. His voice exploded immediately, skipping greetings, skipping pleasantries. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" I stayed. "You think this makes you strong? Waving receipts like some accountant? You think anyone cares? You've always wanted recognition, but here's the truth: being needed isn't the same as being respected. You should know that by now." For a second, his words stunned me. Not from cruelty I expected, but from accuracy. He had just confessed the truth I had lived with for years. They had needed me endlessly, desperately, but they had never respected me. And now that I had stopped being useful, they no longer bothered to hide their contempt. The violin inside me screeched sharp, unbearable, then cut into silence. My reply came slowly, every word deliberate, coated in frost. "You're right," I said. "Being needed isn't respect. And I don't want to be needed if it only means being used. I'm done being just the useful one." His scoff. "You think anyone's going to stand with you? You think people will believe your little notebook?" My voice didn't rise. It sank lower like stones sinking through water. They don't have to believe me. They just have to see the numbers. And the law this time is on my side, not yours. On the other end, silence spread. I could hear his breathing turn ragged, the sound of someone realizing the ground beneath them was slipping. Finally, he muttered, "You're going to regret this." "I already regret everything I gave you," I said. The line went dead with a slam, a sound that rattled inside my ear long after. In my mind, it layered with another sound, the memory of a door slamming not softly this time, but with force enough to shake the frame to mark the end of a chapter. In my imagination, the soundtrack swelled. The violin shrieked strings straining until they snapped, and then came silence. I set the phone beside the ledger. I thought of the girl I had been the one who wired money at midnight, who paid bills that weren't hers, who begged silently for recognition in scraps and glances. That girl was gone. What sat here now was something else entirely. Not just a daughter, not just a sister, a witness, a judge, a woman who had finally placed the evidence on the table and ended the silence with the slam of a door. And now I turn to you, the listener, the witness beyond the story. Because every family has its own courtroom. Every silence hides its own ledger. Maybe yours doesn't sit in a notebook like mine. Maybe it's written in invisible ink across the years, the favors you gave, the debts unpaid, the gratitude withheld. If you were in my place, ledger in hand, contempt exposed the door waiting to close, what would you choose? Would you confront them? Force them to see what they denied? Press 1 for confrontation. Or would you walk away without another word, letting them choke on their silence while you reclaim your life? Press 0 for departure. The decision, like the ledger, remains on the table. I thought that when they were gone, the house would feel like victory, like stepping onto a battlefield still warm with the heat of conquest, like proof carved into wood and brick that I had finally taken back what was mine. I thought it would feel solid, triumphant, an anthem rising inside the walls. But when I pushed the door open and stepped into the silence, what greeted me was not triumph. It was emptiness. The kind of emptiness that doesn't sit still but seeps into your skin. The kind of emptiness that slides under your ribs and makes its home in the hollow spaces you didn't know you had. The golden light of late afternoon spilled through the windows, but even that light seemed weary, stretched thin across the floorboards like old fabric losing its weave. It cast long rectangles that looked more like faded memories than illumination. Dust floated in those beams, slow-moving, lazy, as if time itself had loosened its grip in this place. The dust had no loyalty to battles won or lost. It had drifted through every argument, every dinner, every silence. And here it remained unbothered by the storms that had torn through these walls. The air was colder than I remembered. It carried the faint whistle of wind slipping through the gap under the back door. SFX. The hollow sigh of air through a crack rising and falling like a breath the house itself was struggling to take. I walked slowly, each step echoing louder than it should have in the absence of voices. Voices that had filled these rooms with arguments. Laughter command. The furniture was still here, but stripped of pretense. Chairs angled slightly away from the table as if they too had grown tired of the roles they were forced to play. The sofa slumped its cushions, sunken like tired lungs. I ran my hand across the kitchen counter. My palm brushed the faint ring left by a coffee mug. Stains, scratches, grooves, traces of use. But no warmth. Not anymore. On the table lay a single folded piece of paper. Even before I touched it, I knew the handwriting. My mother's. Neat, controlled, each letter slanted with military precision. I opened it slowly, bracing for another list of debts disguised as gratitude, another gentle manipulation written in the ink of inevitability. But instead, the words were "spare sorry." I should have said it sooner. That was all. No signature. No explanation. Just 7 words dropped into my hands decades too late. I held the note between my fingers, letting it dang. My eyes didn't water. I thought perhaps they would, but grief and longing had already been drained long ago. The apology landed like dust settling, but never shifting the architecture of what was broken. The wind rattled the back door again. SFX, a faint moan slipping through the crack. I closed my eyes and listened. For a moment, it almost sounded like the house whispering regret of its own. Or maybe it was only my imagination desperate to fill the silence with anything but the truth. I moved deeper into the kitchen, leaning against the counter where my hands had once been smeared with flour. I was 15 the first time I baked a pie on my own. Apple cinnamon scattered too heavily, sugar measured too lightly. The crust uneven, the filling bubbling over the edge, but my chest swelled with pride. I had made something for them. I carried it to this very table that someone would say, "Well done. Barbie, this is wonderful." But the knife cut through it without comment. Plates filled without acknowledgement. Conversation rolled forward, skipping me like a stone, skipping water, never sinking in. I laughed nervously back then, telling myself they were distracted, busy, tired. But even then, the truth hovered in the corner like smoke. My offerings were never seen as gifts, only as givens. Now standing in the empty house, the memory replayed sharper than glass. I could almost see my 15-year-old self hovering in the corner apron, too big flour dusting her hair. Eyes darting nervously from face to face, waiting for a word of praise that never arrived. I wanted to reach into that memory to tell her she deserved more, that she didn't need their applause to prove her worth. But memory is a locked room. You can watch through the window, but you can never step inside. The violin in my head was in its place was something quieter, just the whisper of wind through the crack in the back door. SFX, a low sigh repeating every few seconds. My voice, when it finally emerged, was nearly a whisper too. All this time I said to no one I thought if I gave enough they would see me. But this house only knew me as silence. I walked through the living room, trailing my fingers along the walls, passing the pictures they had left hanging. Dean's graduation photo. My mother smiling in her garden. Guests I barely remembered posing at parties. Not one picture of me. Not one. It was as if the walls themselves had been told to forget me. I reached up and pulled one frame down, setting it face first on the floor. Then another, and another. Each thud echoed in the hollow room, small earthquakes marking absence. In the corner, I noticed a scrap of ribbon, its color faded to something between gray and pink. I picked it up. How many gifts had I wrapped with ribbons like this, believing the careful bows might carry my love into their hands? This one must have fallen and been forgotten. Forgotten like me. I returned to the table. The note still waited. Sorry, I should have said it sooner. The words stared up at me, insincere and fragile, like petals pressed too long between pages. I folded the paper again, slid it between the pages of the family ledger I had brought with me. Not because I forgave her, but because even false apologies deserve to be recorded as evidence not of what was given, but of what was missing. Evidence of how late, too late can be. The wind pressed harder against the back door, the sound hollow, restless, insistent. I sat down and let it fill the silence where once their voices had lived. The house felt less like mine than I had imagined, more like a body drained of blood, upright but vacant. I tilted my head back and stared at the ceiling, noticing the hairline cracks spidering outward. They looked almost like veins, as though the house itself were an organism that had finally bled dry. I lowered my gaze back to the table, back to the ledger, back to the folded note tucked inside. My voice, almost inaudible, brushed against the edges of the quiet. "This isn't a home," I said. "It's a museum of absence." The words lingered in the still air, a plaque on an invisible exhibit. Here lies what was missing. And the silence at last felt like agreement. I thought the ending would come with thunder. I thought there would be a speech or doors slamming or cameras flashing as if someone needed to record the exact moment I finally broke free. I thought liberation would be noisy, the kind of freedom you can't mistake for anything else. But the truth is, liberation rarely announces itself. Sometimes it hides in the quiet click of a pen, in the scratch of ink across a page, in a string of numbers typed into a database that no one will ever celebrate. Sometimes freedom lives in silence, so complete that if you weren't paying attention, you might think nothing happened at all. That morning, I walked into the lawyer's office carrying nothing but a folder. Even that folder was almost empty. I did not bring the family ledger with its pages of proof, the old bills with their faded stamps, or even the apology note written too late to matter. I carried only the deed, The paper they had worshipped as proof of belonging. The document they had waved like a flag, their final claim of triumph. The deed had been their shield, their sword, their story. And now it was mine. The office smelled faintly of ink and disinfectant, a sterile blend. The lawyer, kind but distant, adjusted his glasses, slid the papers across the desk, and began to explain what each clause meant. His voice was calm, practiced, professional. I hardly needed the explanation. I had read it all before. What mattered was not the legal jargon, not the clauses or the subclauses. What mattered was the final line where my name would move the house from one history into another. I picked up the pen. My hand did not tremble. I signed slowly, deliberately, dragging the ink across the paper with the intimacy of confession. SFX. The slow drag of a pen, deliberate, measured. It sounded louder to me than 1,000 conversations I had endured at that table. In my mind, piano notes began soft, at first tentative, like the opening bars of a new piece. The kind of melody that doesn't rush but waits, stretching each note long enough for silence to echo around it. And then it was done. With that single signature, the house it didn't even belong to me. It belonged now to a foundation that funded transitional housing for women who had nowhere else to go. Women who had been silenced, erased, dismissed as too much or not enough. Women who had been told they were dramatic, selfish, disposable. Women who had been made invisible in the very places that were supposed to shelter them. It felt right. It felt necessary. That house should never have remained a monument to betrayal. It should not stand as proof of erasure. It should become instead a shelter, a place where doors opened instead of shutting softly in someone's face. There was no press release, no flashbulbs, no photograph printed in the paper. Just a single line of data entered into the county system ownership transferred Women's Empowerment Fund. That was enough. Justice, I realized, doesn't need applause to be real. The room hummed with its small, ordinary sounds, the shuffle of papers, the soft tick of a clock, the muted ringing of a phone in another office. I thought about all the versions of myself that had stood in that house. 15-year-old flower in my hair, waiting for someone to praise my pie. 25 wiring money at midnight after double shifts. 30 mistaken for staff at a party in the house my labor had kept alive. I thought about the years I had waited for a thank you, for recognition, for some acknowledgement that I mattered. And now finally I understood I didn't need their words. I had written my own ending, and it was louder than anything they could have said. When I stepped outside, the sun was brighter than I expected. The air carried the smell of cut grass, sharp and ordinary, the kind of smell you don't notice until you're free enough to breathe it in. And the soundtrack in my mind shifted too. The piano no longer Violins rose not in tension this time, but in release. Cellos anchored the melody. The strings blended into something wide, expansive, like a horizon opening. I wasn't angry. I wasn't even sad. I was free. I knew they would hear about it eventually. My mother would clutch her pearls, her voice breaking into brittle tones. Dean would rage, spitting words like ungrateful, vindictive, reckless. They would sit together and call me cruel, foolish, disloyal. They would rehearse their outrage until it sounded like truth to them. But their outrage no longer carried any weight. It was background noise like traffic outside a closed window. What mattered now was the women who would one day walk through that front door. Women carrying bags of clothes, children on their hips, wounds invisible to everyone but themselves. What mattered was that the house, once a place where I had been erased, would now be a place where others could be restored. And maybe that's the truest kind of, not the kind that punishes, not the kind that burns everything down, but the kind that plants something new in the ashes. I thought of that late apology note. Sorry, I should have said it sooner. Maybe she had meant it. Maybe she hadn't. In the end, it didn't matter, because now the house itself was my answer. That night when I returned home, I opened the family ledger one last time, its pages heavy with ink and memory. I slipped the deed's transfer receipt between them, not as evidence against them, but as evidence for me. Proof that I had turned survival into something more. Proof that I had chosen not to keep the spoils of a battlefield, but to give them to those who still needed shelter. I closed the book slowly. The sound was like a door shutting. But this time the door wasn't shutting me out. It was closing on a chapter I would never return to. I sat by the window. The last light spilled across my face, warm and unhurried. I whispered to myself, voice soft, but steady, I am free. And now I turn to you. Because justice is never just one shape, never just one path. If it were you, if you held the deed, the power, the chance, what would you choose? Would you see justice as punishment, a reckoning that scorches those who hurt you? Press 1 for punishment. Or would you see justice as opportunity? A chance to turn pain into shelter, to hand others the door you were once denied. Press 0 for opportunity. The choice in the end will always be yours. I used to believe that family was an unbreakable word, a law etched into the body, carved into DNA, glued into the photographs that hung on walls, whether or not the faces in them were smiling. I thought blood alone was proof. I thought endurance was loyalty, that if I could just bear enough, carry enough, sacrifice enough, I would earn the unshakable. But as I stand here now, after years of silence, heavy as stones, after sacrifices stacked into ledgers, no one ever honored, after doors that closed with the softness of knives, I know something different, something sharper, something I will not let anyone strip from me again. Family is not blood. Family is respect. Family is boundaries. Without those, family is only a cage that dares to call itself love. My voice does not tremble anymore. It does not fray with pleading. It does not splinter with rage. It does not climb to shout, nor collapse to beg. It settles into certainty the way stone settles into earth. Family is not just blood. It is respect and boundaries. I let the words hang in the air. I want them to echo in every corner, to carve themselves into the silence like etchings on glass. Once spoken, they cannot be rewritten. They are not a request. First, a single piano note, soft but firm, then a harmony building around it. Cellos rise, grounding the sound in something ancient, steady. Violins stretch upward, not in tension, but in release. Not the strained notes of betrayal, not the sharp chords of grief. This is different. This is the sound of a horizon widening, the soundtrack of a door opening instead of closing. For years, I feared that cutting ties would make me cruel, that saying no would make me selfish, that walking away would mark me forever as cold, ungrateful, heartless, that I would fail the very definition of family. But here is the truth I have come to know. Cutting ties does not make you evil. It does not make you cold. It does not mean you failed your family. Cutting ties gives you back to yourself. It is reclamation, not destruction. It is the slow, quiet act of handing yourself the respect that others denied you. Cutting ties does not make you cruel. I say, again firmer this time, each word glowing like iron, heated and hammered into shape. It gives you back to yourself. I imagine those words rippling outward past this room, past the frame of this story, into the lives of those who need to hear them most. Into the ears of the silenced, the overlooked, the invisible, the people who were supposed to be seen most clearly by their families, and yet were rendered shadows. The music rises higher, filling the space that silence once claimed as its kingdom. Brighter now, fuller, a swell of strings wrapping around the piano like sunlight streaming through cracks in a shutter. Then slowly it begins to fade. The piano falls back into hush. The strings bow out gently. What follows is not emptiness, but a long breath of quiet, the kind that doesn't wound but heals. I let the silence stretch. A few seconds that feel like the kind of silence that sinks deep into the bone, that plants itself there and refuses to be erased. The kind of silence that says the story is finished, but its meaning still belongs to you. And then I speak again. Not to myself, but to you. To the ones who have walked with me through these chapters of erasure, confrontation, and liberation. To the ones who have felt their own voices thinned out by the weight of someone else's story. Now it's your turn. Tell me, what does family mean to you? Where did you draw the line? When did you discover that respect matters more than ritual? That love without boundaries is not love at all? Share your story. Break the silence that once kept you small. My voice softens then, but it does not lose its steel. If you have ever had to cut ties in order to breathe, if you have ever reclaimed yourself after being erased, press 1. If you still believe family is unbreakable, no matter the cost, press 0. And if this story has given you something clarity, strength, or simply the comfort of knowing you are not alone, subscribe so you won't miss what comes next. Because there are more stories ahead. And one of them might be yours. The screen fades. The final image light spilling through an open door, soft but undeniable stretching into the distance. The music dissolves into silence. The story is done.